Alexander was in a different mood that day and gave them a placid response, saying that it was his duty as a Christian to forgive his enemies. This is what made Alexander impossible to deal with.
Nah, bro. Congress of Vienna. About time that I started to do this. Alright. And I need to react to more historia civilis
Summer
videos.
Of 1814,
honestly.
The combined strength of Europe brought France to its knees. After almost 25 years.
Combined strength of Europe. More like freaking Russia's freaking Russian summer and Russian winter. And even then, like, Napoleon kind of lost himself. That, like, it really kind of still blows my mind how he sold even when he could have still won.
Years of war, Europe was finally at peace. Nobody knew this at the time, but the peace that was negotiated here and now served as the launching pad for a 99-year run without a major war between great powers. A monumental achievement.
What about the Crimean War?
After hostilities ceased, the immediate problem was that nobody quite knew what the world looked like anymore. The preliminary peace agreement that ended the war in 1814 restored international borders as they had existed in 1792, with some slight modifications. But these borders on the map no longer reflected the reality on the ground. The Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, existed on paper, but in reality it was under Russian occupation. All of these tiny German states existed on paper, but in reality they were under Prussian control. France existed on paper, but in reality it was under the joint occupation of the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British. All that being said, by the summer of 1814, the Treaty of Paris had been signed. The 1792 borders had been temporarily thrown back into place, and the war was over, at least for now.
Oh, that's so weird to look at.
The urgent task at hand was to take this hyper-volatile international system and transform it into something more stable. Most people recognized that the 1792 borders were no good in the long run, because those borders had led directly to almost 25 years of war. The prevailing mood among the victors was that a well-balanced...
Well, I wouldn't really say the borders is what led to almost 25 years of war. If it's referring to the Napoleonic Wars, I would actually argue that the fact that Europe were absolute monarchies at the time and the people barely had any basic human necessities was what led to 25 years of war. Because, of course, the 1848 revolution would happen, so that still kind of proves my point, actually.
International system was necessary, one that could resist the kind of reckless expansionism that the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world. But before we talk about the new system that was created at this time, let's first discuss the 5 great powers as they existed in 1814. This whole period of instability began with the French Revolution, so let's start with France. Defeated, under enemy occupation, but nevertheless, still a great power.
Bro, France is the juggernaut of this time period. Hands down. No questions about that.
When Napoleon was defeated, the Allied victors imposed a set of peace conditions upon France. All things considered, they were pretty moderate. The first of these called for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy from before the Revolution. This brought the 58-year-old King Louis XVIII to the throne, the younger brother to the king that was executed under the Revolution.
Hold on. Oh, wow. That's crazy that the Bourbon still had people alive. Wow. Oh, yeah. Wasn't Spain also Bourbon as well? Oh.
The second condition for peace was a shiny new French constitution that would guarantee certain political rights. The third condition was an agreement from the new king to leave many of the revolutionary reforms in place. The massive redistribution of wealth and land was to be mostly upheld by the new regime. So it goes. The old French aristocracy were allowed to safely return.
And this is why when I reacted to my Napoleonic Wars, Battle of France, go check it out if you haven't checked it out by Epic History TV after this video. This is why when I reacted to that and I said that French people were weak and everyone got mad at me, was because it was more than obvious that when the Bourbons would come back, that they would kind of break their promise. And it's like, you can't get mad at Napoleon because the people were radical at the time. At the time, it was radical, which naturally provoked all of Europe, and Napoleon just so happened to be around and was just a literal genius that he defended France. Like, obviously, that's going to take a lot of deaths, but you can't blame Napoleon for that. He was just defending France. Most of the time, anyways. He was most of the time. Besides the Spain fiasco and arguably the Russian fiasco as well. But, because it's like, you know, you asked for it, you got it, so defend it. The heck?
To the country, but they were a shadow of their former selves, and never again rose to the dominant political position that they had enjoyed in the 18th century. The restoration of the Bourbon king was intended to make the conservatives happy. The new constitution was intended to make the moderate liberals happy. The preservation of the Republican reforms was intended to make the revolutionaries happy. It was a big, sloppy compromise, and its purpose was to hold France together so that there was actually a France for the Allies to negotiate with. Despite its recent defeat, France remained a heavyweight on the continent. They were the second most populous country in Europe, and still controlled the most potent military force in the world. So long as those facts remained true, France would remain a great power.
Bro, France is what America is today. Okay? You see how France literally took on everyone in Europe and beat them back? Only lost because of freaking bad weather in Russia. Okay? That's basically America. America could take on the whole world and would win. Okay? That's crazy, bruh. Like, that's actually really insane to think about. The more you think about it, like, French people are very snobby, but if there's one thing that I can give French people, is the fact that their country really was a juggernaut in this time period. Like, honestly, until Germany came.
With
and
that in mind, France's objective going into the upcoming peace negotiations was, to the extent possible, minimize any future French concessions or territorial losses. Many European leaders understood that France would need to opt in to any new international system if there was to be lasting peace. Others were simply out for blood. France's job for the immediate future would be to keep the wolves at bay.
Alright.
To this end, the new king brought in an experienced hand to serve as his foreign minister, Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a French nobleman who got in on the ground floor of the French Revolution. Wasn't
this a guy who legit like snaked Napoleon?
Revolution, he became a politician, then a diplomat, then an early supporter of Napoleon. Talleyrand served as Napoleon's foreign minister for 8 years, until the two had a falling out, and Talleyrand resigned. After this, Talleyrand began telling others that Napoleon's endless lust for war would bring ruin upon France. In time, he began passing intelligence to France's enemies and launched preliminary discussions with them regarding what a post-Napoleonic France might look like.
So he did snake Napoleon.
Him an obvious choice to bring back into government after France was defeated. That's the generous way of looking at Talleyrand. The ungenerous way of looking at him is that he was a cockroach, a survivor, an opportunist.
Yeah,
Every time
I agree.
political winds began to shift, Talleyrand suddenly found himself on the other side. Every
That's
time the
literally
French
how I
government
viewed
looked
him.
unstable, Talleyrand found an excuse to be out of the country. When it became clear that France would not win the war, Talleyrand was the first to abandon ship. Boats.
That's crazy, bro. What the?
But no matter what,
That's so out of pocket.
Talleyrand became the most powerful person in the French government after the fall of Napoleon. And yes, I am including the king when I say that. His great task as foreign minister would be to keep the wolves at bay and reintegrate France back into the international order as a co-equal great power. Let's now turn our attention to the four great powers that brought Napoleonic France to its knees, starting with the greatest of the great powers and working our way down.
Britain. Let's see what he says about Britain.
As always, the historian Eric Hobsbawm puts it better than I ever could. Britain, quote, had by 1815 gained the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world, having emerged from 20 years of war against France as the only industrialized economy, the only naval power, and virtually the only colonial power in the world.
Alright. So I remember in one of my Napoleonic Wars video, I made a little joke where Britain had so much money, and I said, "Oh, where did Britain get all that money from?" Because I was making a joke about how the slave labor in the Caribbean, like made Britain so much money from the sugarcane crops, right? Look, guys, I know that Britain eventually got rid of slavery because of industrialization, but I'm not saying this because I'm from there, but like without my country, Barbados, keep in mind at its peak, my home city, Bridgetown, actually was the third richest city in the whole new world. Okay, it was generating that much money in the entire new world. Okay, only behind Haiti. Everyone knew Haiti was just cash galore, right? From their slave sugarcane plantations, and only behind, I think, what was it, Boston? Aside from that, it was like super rich. Okay, so rich, in fact, the British guarded all of Barbados, my country, so much so that they built literally like over 40 forts. Okay, 40 forts. Okay, my home city, Bridgetown, even got the nickname Fortress Bridgetown. Okay, I say this because without Barbados, Britain wouldn't really like Barbados was that stepping stone that Britain needed to ascend. Frankly, I'm not saying that because I'm from there. That's just true. Like, if you truly know the history of the British Empire, okay, you would understand what I'm saying. Like, it's just weird to think a British Empire without Barbados. That's very weird, considering Barbados was a key component, a lethal component, right? So, yes, Britain eventually industrialized. However, they wouldn't have been able to industrialize without the previous money, all that money from the slave labor, from the cash crops. I mean, there's a reason why they call sugar white gold. Sugar was literally called white gold for a reason, people. It's like what oil is today. People call oil black gold for a reason. That's what sugar was, okay? So I'm not just saying this all of my butt. I'm not. It's just that's just what it was, frankly speaking. So every time I see these people who are like, oh, at this point, and this is literally 1814, slavery was still around anyway. So, because I had someone point out that, oh, by this point, like 3% of British money was coming from slave labor. Yeah, obviously, because Britain eventually diversified its economy, which anyone with a brain would do, right? But remove the cash crop, remove the white gold, okay, remove Barbados, hell, remove Jamaica too, because Jamaica was actually sort of profitable as well, right? And yeah, Britain just don't have that initial money, okay? Because you need to also remember the 13 colonies weren't even profitable themselves. The 13 colonies was actually draining Britain of more money than she was getting from it. So imagine Britain with 13 colonies that's not really generating any money. That doesn't have Barbados, doesn't have Jamaica, because Jamaica also has sugar too. That was eventually, I think Jamaica eventually surpassed Barbados because Jamaica is naturally bigger. But just imagine that, okay? Where would Britain get the money to industrialize? Okay, so I'm not one of those liberal people who cries about, oh, slavery, blah blah blah, because like, mostly speaking, when the Europeans arrived to Africa, they just bought slaves. So they were already enslaved. Whenever I see people look at me and tell me, oh, how dare I kiss up to my colonizer, I always look at them and I say, why would I go and kiss up the very people who enslaved me in the first place? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
The thing that made Britain the greatest of the great powers.
I want to say enslaved. I'm talking about the Africans who literally warred each other, okay? Who literally sacrificed, okay? Literally. I was talking to my father about this the other day, and I was telling him, thank God I was in Africa back then. I didn't want to be sacrificed to a god, have my head get chopped off like what the Aztecs did. No. And we got morons in 2024 who's trying to promote this nonsensical pan-Africanism and tells you that I'm kissing up my colonizers. No. I'm just simply proud of my heritage.
Was the Royal Navy. Sometimes people talk about strategic depth, which is the idea that during wartime, you want the lines of battle drawn as far from your major population centers as possible.
That is
In
true.
1815, Britain's strategic depth extended to all the world's oceans and beyond. No country has ever been safer from invasion. The moment of Britain's great victory was also a moment of great uncertainty for the British monarchy. George III was king and was unable to enjoy Britain's newfound prosperity. George probably suffered from a number of genetic disorders, as well as other things like bipolar disorder and dementia.
Oh, that's crazy. King George III was still king? What?
It was quite bad. He was in constant physical pain and suffered from hallucinations, delusions, and memory loss. He was occasionally coherent, but not often and not for long. In 1811, at the height of the war, the British Parliament transferred the powers of the monarchy to the king's 48-year-old son, which made him the Prince Regent. Within a few years, the king was no longer presentable enough to appear in public.
Jeez, man. God, this is one of my worst fears, dude. I don't want to go out like that.
Britain's dominant geopolitical position was all the more impressive, considering the fact that of the 5 great powers, Britain was the 4th most populous. But the picture becomes more clear when you look at wealth. In 1815, The British people were on average the wealthiest people in the world, at least 50% wealthier than their counterparts on the continent. This
Of course.
trend would continue for the rest of the century.
Of
and
course.
by the year 1900, they would be almost twice as wealthy as the average European.
Of
This
course, that makes
incredible
sense.
Wealth and geopolitical security helped produce a uniquely robust political culture with lively debates and an informed electorate.
You know, something that always annoys me is I hear a lot of these people always say, oh, Britain was wealthy, but they just never explain where that wealth came from.
In 1815, the British Prime Minister was the Earl of Liverpool, a kind of
Or if they do say where the wealth came from, they'll say, oh, Britain industrialized. No, start from the roots. Okay, start from the very beginning. All right?
centrist conservative. The fact that he was kind of conservative was a huge deal. It was the manifestation of a seismic shift going on within British politics. Let me explain why. Since the 17th century, there had been two political factions within the British Parliament. The Whigs, a liberal faction who favored giving Parliament more power, and the Tories, a conservative faction who favored giving the king more power. England in the 17th century was utterly consumed by the power struggle between these two factions. They even fought a civil war over it. Over the course of this struggle, England swung wildly between having an authoritarian king and no king at all, sending one to the grave.
I should
and
react to that
another
video.
in exile.
I should react
By
to
the
yeah.
end of the 17th
I'm gonna react
century,
to this
the question was settled.
in the future.
The Whigs won. Parliament became the supreme political authority in England, and the monarchy began to fade into the background. This brought about
Or
a
that's
really
what they want you to
strange
think.
period in British politics, something that will never happen again. For more than 100 years, every British Prime Minister was a Whig. This period is sometimes called the Whig supremacy or the Whig domination, sometimes even the Whig oligarchy. I like the term Whig oligarchy because it gets at one of the key political truths of this period. I described the Whigs as the faction of Parliament, but it might be more accurate to describe them as the faction of modernity and industrialization. This meant that Whig political power emanated from cities and business and capital, while Tory political power emanated from aristocratic landowners and the countryside.
Fun fact, okay? There are literally people in the British Parliament, okay, in the House of Lords, who literally still own the very sugarcane fields, okay, in Barbados. It's still their property. The government can't do anything about it. It's super controversial. Because all the if there is one thing that I do believe that actually should be dealt with, it's probably that. Like it's probably that. But I don't like how the government goes around and is basically deleting history and like abolishing the monarchy in such a horrible manner. And freaking removing the Nelson statue because, oh, dude, you know, I'm gonna save that Nelson bit for my Nelson reaction. But if there's one thing that I do agree is that the government needs to go and confiscate those lands that those plantation owners still have, frankly speaking, because there's literally like mass graves of slaves that died on those plantations there. But the problem is that it's like private property, legally speaking. It's so weird. But yeah, like after slavery was abolished, like the land never went anywhere. Their descendants just simply inherited it, right? So a lot of these places in the English Caribbean, Anglophone Caribbean, Commonwealth Caribbean, whichever term you want to use. Yeah, no, there's a bunch of people in the British Parliament who still owns like the same land down there. Like, so they just inherited it.
At the time, the Whig modernist and pro-business worldview called for free trade and religious toleration, alongside a slow and steady expansion of political rights. The Whigs had a general distaste for slavery in all its forms, even while they continued to participate in the business of slavery.
Hey, look. if it's already there, might as well.
For more than 100 years, the Whigs dominated British politics, and for the first 50 or 60 years, there were basically no close elections. The Whigs routinely won 300 to 400 seats in Parliament, and the other factions were lucky to break 100. With such a dominant command over Parliament, it was only a matter of time before the Whig faction started to develop its own factions, and then factions within factions.
Of course.
And then factions within factions within factions. This competition between sub-factions actually made elections competitive again, and in the 1770s, Britain elected its first Whig prime minister from the conservative sub-faction. During the French Revolution, perhaps in reaction to the French Revolution, Britain elected several more conservative Whig prime ministers. But they all took great care to calm people's nerves and make it clear that they were all still Whigs. They were all members of one big political party. One was brave enough to brand himself as an independent Whig, whatever that means, but nobody dared go any further. So by 1814, Lord Liverpool, another conservative Whig, was Prime Minister. But he was in an impossible situation. His conservative Whig majority in Parliament was modest, and his sub-faction seemed to be falling apart. 4 men were asked to form a government before him, and all 4 failed to hold the coalition together. The only reason Liverpool was able to get the job done was because although he was a conservative Whig, he was on the liberal end of the conservative Whig spectrum. I spoke of factions within factions within factions before. I was not joking. As soon as peace was announced, protests started popping up all over England calling for bread or blood. One publication at the time wrote that, quote, all the triumphant sensations of national glory seem almost obliterated by general depression. Change was in the air. It was not a good time to be a conservative politician in Britain. In fact, it seemed entirely possible that the conservative Whig moment was simply a reaction to the French Revolution, and with peace, the liberal Whig natural order may just reassert itself.
Yeah, it makes sense. It reminds me of how Churchill, the guy responsible for the British Empire falling apart, wasn't re-elected after the war.
All of that is simply a long-winded way of saying that when it was time to negotiate with the other great powers, Liverpool found himself politically constrained from every direction. If the negotiations went badly, he could not only be thrown out of government, but the conservative Whig sub-faction could be wiped out forever. The peace negotiations would be handled by the British Foreign Secretary, the Viscount of Castlereagh.
Castlereagh the
Castlereagh
goat?
had strong opinions when it came to Europe. There were some pro-war nuts in the conservative Whig sub-faction, but he was not one of them. Castlereagh's view was that every British intervention on the continent was a colossal policy failure. If he had his way, Britain would never again send an army to Europe. One of the reasons Castlereagh thought this way is because he was an imperialist. As Hobsbawm said, Britain at this time was virtually the only colonial power in the world. Some of the more liberal Whigs had mixed feelings about that, but Castlereagh didn't.
Wow. Only colonial power in the world. I'm trying to think. Technically, Russia is a colonial power. They just simply expanded eastward. France, France didn't really. Oh yeah. I mean, France still had a bit of overseas territory, but not really like anything noteworthy. Oh wow, yeah. Technically, America is also a colonial power too.
He thought it was awesome.
So
he believed that Britain's future was out in the colonies, and it would be best for Britain if Europe remained stable and peaceful and boring. There was some hypocrisy at work here. Peace between the great powers meant that nobody was allowed to touch any of Britain's new conquests. Peace between the great powers meant that Britain could instead maintain its advantage and focus on making money off of its colonies. All of that being said, Liverpool and Castlereagh genuinely wanted peace. The British public had been exhausted by the war, and if the conservative Whigs wanted to maintain their majority, they were going to have to show some results. Together, Liverpool and Castlereagh came up with a list of specific goals for the upcoming negotiations. The most important item was that they wanted the Netherlands reformed and strengthened on the English Channel. Two reasons for this. First, they wanted an ally on the continent to break up any consolidation along the coast. Second, this was historically a natural path for French expansion, and going forward, the British wanted to cut that off.
Natural path for French expansionism. Oh, and soon they will become the natural path for Germany.
They also wanted
that's
the French
funny.
out of Spain, and Spain restored to its previous borders under its previous monarch. Castlereagh
France
also
was
had
still in
instructions
Spain?
to make sure that the new peace deal would keep Italy free from French influence. Historically, every time the French started messing around with Italy, it meant that France was becoming way too powerful. No more. Going forward, Italy would be a red line. Castlereagh had other goals as well, but the big ones were all about containing France. Before the peace negotiations began, Castlereagh back-channeled his list of priorities to both Austria and Prussia, and got from them an unofficial thumbs up. At least two of the other great powers wouldn't oppose any of Britain's big-ticket items, and France wasn't exactly in a place to put up much of a fight. The only remaining unknown going into the negotiations was Russia. Nobody quite knew what they wanted or what their intentions were.
Russia! Can we get an effing chat for the fact that YouTube is banned mostly in Russia? Like, I kid you not, I lost like 90% of my freaking Russian viewers that watch my stuff. I literally lost 90% of my Russian viewers. It's so bad. And the worst part is that the Russian viewers were like my best viewers. Like, they were actually some good quality viewers, and then freaking Putin, oh my gosh, went and did that basically YouTube ban. Oh, that hurts,
When
man.
Castlereagh met Tsar Alexander of Russia for the first time, he wrote to his prime minister that he believed that the Russian monarch was not of sound mind. It's difficult to characterize Tsar Alexander because it seems that most of his mental energy was caught up in creating narratives about what kind of person he was, and not so much in what he did or how he behaved. The thing that confused Castlereagh, and confuses me to be honest, is that Alexander had 8 or 10 of these narratives going through his head at the same time, and wasn't particularly bothered when they contradicted each other. Let me give you some...
Alright, so he's insane.
Alexander considered himself a true Enlightenment monarch, and told anybody who would listen that he believed in a limited constitutional monarchy, and wanted Russia to have elections, and a parliament, and independent courts. At the same time, he ruled Russia as a tyrannical dictator.
Exactly,
which
stop
was
the
justified
cap.
in his mind because he believed that he was God's chosen instrument on earth. These two thoughts
Stop
are not
the cap,
compatible,
bruh.
but Alexander did not see a contradiction. He would simply switch between these two modes of thought, depending on who he was talking to and how he felt that day. Here's another example. Alexander
This man is basically a woman in a man's body.
believed himself to
What
be the
the
most
heck?
honorable man in Europe, a man who revered ritual and tradition and justice. Simultaneously, he believed that God made him emperor of Russia for a reason, and if he needed to go back on his word and use brute force to implement his will, that was all part of God's plan.
Now, I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm a Christian, right? And I actually kind of do believe that, like, God puts people in certain scenarios for different reasons. So, I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't care if you call me dumb, but he might have a point. He might have a point. Like, if you look at the Bible, the Word of God, it literally says that, like, God literally puts everyone where they are in their life for a reason. But you might be asking yourself, guy who isn't really a Christian, why in the world would God do something like that? Simple. Because God wants to see how we're going to treat other people in certain positions. A lot of people tend to forget that the reason why we're on earth is literally because it's just a test to see, basically in a nutshell, how much of a good person you are. That's it. Nothing crazy, nothing complex. That's it. That's why God puts everyone in certain scenarios, because he wants to see, how are you going to react to this if you're in this situation? How are you going to treat this person if you have this power? Right? Simple. So, yeah, probably. He probably was put there by God, frankly speaking. So,
these contradictory beliefs made Alexander impossible to deal with. His positions came off as utterly random, and they could change at any time depending on his mood. He was unpredictable and unreliable and incomprehensible, particularly bad traits for a diplomat. So naturally, Alexander selected himself to represent Russia at the post-war peace conference.
Of course, Mother Russia. Bro, I love Russia, bro. I'm like a huge Russian sympathizer.
As the most populous country in Europe, Russia was a formidable land power. But that inherent strength was undercut by weak institutions, weak governance, and the fact that Russia remained a technological backwater.
It blows my mind how Russia, the freaking tyrants of Russia, really held back Russia. Like, the one tyrant of Russia that probably hasn't held back Russia is probably Putin. And yeah, honestly, I would probably just say Putin. Because although he's an oligarch tyrant, Russia, and you can go look this up yourself, Russia has been steadily improving since the fall of the Soviet Union. Steadily under Putin. So yeah, that's, considering Russian history, that's good.
This backwardness had always been a source of immense insecurity for Russian monarchs. But by 1814, all that insecurity was gone. Russia had just done the impossible and defeated Napoleon. At least, in their own imagination, that's what happened. The truth is a little more complicated. Years of careful diplomacy
Napoleon defeated himself
for a coordinated attack against the French, and Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia was simply the catalyst. Had Napoleon been successful in Russia, the rest of Europe's great powers would have just waited for the next opportunity. But when the French started losing to Russia, most of Europe sprang into action. The plan was for every major European army to advance on Paris at a steady pace, but to pull back whenever opposed by the French army. The Allies knew that they couldn't defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but with all of Europe's armies advancing as one, they wouldn't have to. Napoleon couldn't be everywhere at once. Even if he won every possible battle, the Allies would still take Paris. The point is that no one country defeated Napoleon. Every country defeated Napoleon.
That's a fair statement.
But Tsar...
And also, Napoleon just lost himself. I'm gonna say that forever and ever and ever.
Alexander didn't see it like this. In his mind, it was all his doing. As part of their plan, the Allies had developed lists of key French towns to capture on the way to Paris. The Allied armies would need their logistical support, especially with several French armies coming up behind them. Tsar Alexander was personally in command of the Russian army, and once he was within spitting distance of French territory, he abandoned this plan and broke off from his allies and advanced on Paris alone. Alexander later said that this was a matter of personal honor. Never mind the commitment to his allies to all advance as one. Apparently, personal honor can only go so far. It was Tsar Alexander of Russia who took Paris, and it was Tsar Alexander who accepted Napoleon's surrender. Since Alexander placed himself in the center of the action, the fact that he liked to tell conflicting narratives about himself suddenly became very important to world history. On one hand, Alexander styled himself as the grand enemy of the French, as Napoleon finally meeting his match on the field of battle. On the other hand, Alexander still believed that he was the most honorable man in Europe.
Bro, Alexander, choose, man. What the heck, Alexander? What the? Oh my gosh, bro. I swear, bro. Look, guys. If you're not like me, okay, who don't have the physical capabilities to attract women, okay? I'm not saying it's a brag. You should already bring this up. But like, guys, I swear to you, this is literally how like women act. Like, this is literally why I stay away from most women. Oh my gosh, like I'm listening to this, I'm like, what the heck? This is like your average woman in 2024.
Randomizer, and what do we get? Honor. Today,
I'm sure some of y'all can relate to what I just said.
Would
I
treat
cannot be the only one.
As the enemy
I swear,
but as his equal.
All of y'all are adults, at least mostly. Okay, I checked my statistics. Y'all are like early 20s. Some of y'all in your 30s, 40s. But some of y'all will know exactly what I'm saying. Some of y'all don't really get any much attention from women. I'm just gonna be quite honest. So you wouldn't really understand. If you don't understand, then oh well. Not really a big deal. You're not really missing out.
The Emperor of Russia meeting with the Emperor of France. It was as equals that Alexander negotiated Napoleon's surrender. And as equals, Alexander gave Napoleon almost everything he wanted. Napoleon would be allowed to retain the title of emperor and would be permitted to remain an independent monarch until his death, ruling over the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He wouldn't be allowed to leave, but on the island, he would be a free man. The Allies were apoplectic. This was not what they had agreed to. This put the British in particular in a terrible position because they had deliberately never recognized Napoleon as the legitimate emperor of France. Now, for some reason, the Russian Tsar was forcing them to legitimize Napoleon only in defeat. It was humiliating. When the rest of the Allies arrived in Paris, several of their leaders got up in Alexander's face and went ballistic. Alexander was in a different mood that day and gave them a placid response, saying that it was his duty as a Christian to forgive his enemies. This is what made Alexander impossible to deal with.
Nah, bro. Oh my gosh, dude. Oh, nah. Oh, I'm getting so much PTSD. Holy crap.
He was saying that Napoleon had to remain an emperor for religious reasons. Yesterday, it was because of honor and tradition. Tomorrow, who knows? The Austrian foreign minister summarized these events in a report to his monarch, in which he called Alexander, and this is a real quote, the biggest baby on earth.
Nah, not baby. Even a baby wouldn't act like this. Nah, bro, I think it would be much more. Yeah, man. He's not a baby. He's just an average chick in 2024.
He continued.
Bro, let me say something, right? Actually, nah. Because a lot of men are acting like this, too. I saw this wonderful quote where someone said that men are beginning to act like women in 2024. Yo, Tsar Alexander, you're a man ahead of your time, and you don't even know it.
Quote, he has started out by doing a great deal of harm. We have repaired some of it, but we will suffer for some time as a result of those things he got up to in those first moments when he got away from us. Alexander's stated priorities going into the peace conference kinda depended on his mood, but it mostly had to do with the future of France. As previously discussed, the Allies had all agreed to restore the old Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. The problem was that Alexander didn't like the Bourbon kings. If you look at France's position in Europe, France had an interest in making sure that Central Europe remained fragmented and weak, and outside of the influence of any other great power. To these ends, France had a long history of aligning itself with countries like Poland and Saxony and the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, a geopolitical thing, but Tsar Alexander thought it was a personal thing, and that the Bourbon kings uniquely had a problem with Russia. Alexander's immediate priority was to keep the Bourbon Louis XVIII off of the French throne. He suggested making Napoleon's 4-year-old son the King of France, but Talleyrand patiently explained to him that this would allow Napoleon to pull the strings from exile. Alexander then tried to put a man named Bernadotte on the French throne. Bernadotte was a former French marshal who had turned against Napoleon and was single-handedly responsible for bringing Sweden into the coalition against France. In the late stages of the war, Bernadotte and Alexander had worked closely together, and Alexander viewed him as the one Frenchman he could trust. Alexander pushed hard.
Bernadotte. Bro, I swear, I can't hate on this guy. It's like, I want to, but I can't hate on him. Oh!
For Bernadotte, but Talleyrand wouldn't budge. He and the Allies had all agreed on a Bourbon restoration, and they all saw Bernadotte for what he was, an attempt to put a Russian puppet on the French throne. Talleyrand explained to Alexander that they couldn't be placing whomever they wished on the French throne, or they were no better than the revolutionaries. The new king needed to be a legitimate French king of royal blood. Alexander got desperate. What about a distant cousin, a younger brother, anybody but Louis XVIII? Talleyrand held firm, and Alexander backed down. An impressive feat, considering that the Russians had Paris under military occupation. A Bourbon king would return to the French throne, and Alexander's dream of
but Paris under military occupation, I mean, still, you can't really anger the other great powers of Europe.
a grand Franco-Russian alliance withered and died.
Austria, the one that got embarrassed the most in the Napoleonic Wars.
I mentioned the Austrian foreign minister before, and how he had a rather dim opinion of the Russian Tsar. Biggest baby on earth, and all that. The Austrian foreign minister's name was Clemens von Metternich, and the period we're beginning to cover today is sometimes called the Age of Metternich. That's a clue as to his importance. Metternich would become the architect of the post-war international system, and one of the 19th century's most preeminent figures. Metternich's task was vastly harder than it seemed, because not only was the international system undergoing a stark transformation at the time, but so was Austria. Of course, what I'm referencing here is the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. And now my punishment for bringing up the Holy Roman Empire is that I have to explain what it was. We should begin with the French philosopher Voltaire's famous quip that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire.
Bro, I have tried to understand how the Holy Roman Empire worked, and the best thing that I could get from the Holy Roman Empire was that it was a faction, like a confederation, I guess. But wouldn't a confederation be like a country? Right? I will never understand.
So what was it?
I would say that the Holy Roman Empire was a country because it was the first German empire, air quotes. So
the Holy Roman Empire was a Central European institution that had existed in one.
Yeah, it's like what do we call it? You call it a country? Like, what do we call it?
For 1,000 years. I say institution because the Holy Roman Empire was by no means a state. Each member of the empire conducted its own foreign policy, with its own military, under its own laws. Hundreds of tiny states were members of this club, this institution, and together...
But that's the thing, a lot of people don't talk about how a confederation works. In a confederation, the individual states have the power. In a federation, the central government has the power ish. Like, it's not like a confederation is basically like super loose. A federation is the opposite of that, essentially. Like, America is a federation, Russia is a federation, although Russia has gotten a bit too centralized. That would you really call that a federation? I don't know, but just no one really do like confederation type of system countries because it's bad. It's really bad. Like, it's so bad. Like, yeah, it's just bad. Like, confederation system, just bad, way too bad. The Holy Roman Empire was actually a good example of why, like, you should never do a confederation. The Confederates in the American Civil War was also a confederation. They wanted more power to the states because, again, the Civil War was fought over slavery because of, the fact that slaves were the economic lifeblood of the South, and the South were arguing it as states' rights because, crying that the federal government was encroaching on their states' rights. So that's why when the Confederates succeeded, they chose the confederation system, but still, it's still a bad system. It's just too. The problem is when you give the power to the states, anything can happen. It's so like unstable. The Holy Roman Empire. Like, come on, everyone should know. Pay attention to the Holy Roman Empire history. So I don't even need to talk about that anymore.
They supported a central emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was a prestigious title with very little actual power behind it. He could call for aid if one of the member states was attacked, but it was up to each independent state whether or not they were.
Yes, that's confederation for you.
In fact, each state had its own unique deal worked out with the imperial crown, which put further limits on the emperor's power. Some were expected to contribute money to military campaigns, but no soldiers. Some were expected to contribute soldiers, but no money. Some were under no obligation to offer anything at all. By the 17th century, the Holy Roman Emperor could no longer even have an opinion on religious matters, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the holy part of their title.
Wow.
Although the imperial crown was remarkably weak, the Holy Roman Emperor usually controlled the most powerful state within the empire. Beginning in the 15th century and continuing up until the Napoleonic Wars, that meant that the Holy Roman Emperor was the Archduke of Austria. Since the 13th century, Austria had been controlled by the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in Europe, and at times over the last 500 years, they had controlled Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Germany, parts of northern Italy, Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia. I could go on. The dynasty...
Wait, the Habsburgs controlled... Wow, I didn't even know the Habsburgs freaking controlled Germany at one point.
Remarkably successful, and what made it especially remarkable is that very little of this territory was gained through conquest. It was instead gained diplomatically. The Austrian Habsburgs had a family motto: "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry. For those kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to thee." Others conquer through war. The Habsburgs conquer through marriage. Fast forward to the 19th century.
Facts.
The Holy Roman Emperor was still an Austrian Habsburg, now facing an expansionist France under Napoleon. He learned too late that the Holy Roman Empire was not equipped to face a direct attack. A victorious Napoleon demanded the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Habsburg Emperor, having decided that this powerless husk was no longer worth defending, agreed. With that, Austria became fully independent under its first emperor, Francis I.
So, Austria became fully independent. Yeah, this is why you don't do confederation countries, kiddos. A Although what's funny is that the Confederation of the Rhine, the thing that replaced the Holy Roman Empire, replaced that.
I lay all of that groundwork because by 1814, Austria was at a crossroads. The new Empire of Austria had played a critical role in the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. But now what? They could reform the Holy Roman Empire if they wished, but did they wish? When push came to shove, some of the largest members of the empire sided with Napoleon. If the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a military alliance, what good was it? Yes, the title was prestigious, but you could argue that the restrictions within the empire only slowed Austria down, with no clear benefit. Francis, the former Holy Roman Emperor and the current Austrian Emperor, was sympathetic to this point of view, as was his foreign minister, Metternich. Metternich is sometimes described as a conservative or a reactionary, but that's not quite right. A true reactionary would have fought to reform the Holy Roman Empire, but Metternich happily allowed it to die. He was a realist, not that concerned with ideology, so long as it protected his hard-won peace. In his excellent and definitive biography of Metternich, Wolfram Zeeman writes that, quote, "This, the question of whether Metternich was reactionary, disregards the experiences of human beings who were looking back at 25 years of war and revolution. The question contemporary witnesses asked themselves was whether the more than 3 million dead on the battlefields of Europe had died for any meaningful goal. In many peasant families, there were no male youths left."
Ooh.
That 3 million number is
bad. No male youths left. That's awful. Men are the backbone of society. What are you gonna do when you have no men left to take the brunt of the freaking everything, frankly speaking? You wanna know what I find hilarious, right? Let me tell you this quick story. I was at my job the other day, right? And I was talking to a manager who, I wouldn't really call him a history buff, but he's knows somewhat about history. I was telling him how that like men are the ones like men throughout all of history were the ones like the backbone of society. Like without society, like, you know, without men, society wouldn't be able to function. Dude, he looks at me and he says, like he thought that was he thought that wasn't really the case. Like he says, like he thinks that's a myth. And you're like, oh, there are many women who influence men a lot to like start a bunch of wars and whatnot. Like, bro, like, just because you have influence over something doesn't really mean anything, because again, without men, who's gonna keep society functioning? I'm not one of those cringe edgelord like manosphere people. I'm not. In fact, I actually clown those people. But it's just a fact. The fact is, without men, what do we know? Society, okay? And no society, well, women can't influence anything. So, just, I don't know. It just kind of reminded me of that conversation. Like, it didn't really make any sense what he said, but I didn't really say anything, which is funny because he is subscribed to my channel, but he's not gonna see this video. I doubt he's not gonna see this video. No. And even if he does see this, hey, look, if you see this video, right, and you see this part, that's not an insult, by the way, okay? That's not an insult, okay? I'm just giving my take. Again, this is why I have a YouTube channel, all right? I give my own opinions without having to go back and forth to people. That's annoying. I can say whatever I want. I don't really gotta go back and forth with people. I can say whatever I want clearly without worrying about getting interrupted, any of that. That's why I have this YouTube channel.
Is on the lower end of the spectrum. I've seen credible estimates of 5
So that you have time to actually think about what I say, and you're not busy thinking about. And this goes for everyone, by the way. This goes for everyone, okay? This goes for everyone, all right?
to 7 million when you include civilians. Unthinkable loss. Nobody who lived through this period would ever be the same. Across France, 20% of the men born between 1790 and 1795 were dead. An entire
not too bad.
generation of young men had been wiped out. In that same book,
Oh, that's actually
provides the
bad.
best
Oh, wow.
summary of Metternich's worldview that I've ever seen. In Metternich's case, coming to terms with the war meant considering the suffering he had witnessed endless times on the battlefields and along the roads.
Dog, didn't Metternich, didn't he saw the aftermath of Leipzig? Oh,
Unnecessary,
grueling.
pointless, even a crime, caused by human delusions of grandeur that, he thought, could pull down the walls protecting civilization and the law as he understood it, at any time and in any place. It was the duty of politics to erect enduring barriers against this possibility. He opposed this catastrophe on humanitarian grounds, and his lasting commitment was never again. Metternich saw balance between great powers as the answer. He feared a second French Revolution, or something like it, but he couldn't clearly see how Austria could possibly prevent one. However, with a balanced international system, any state seeking to dominate could simply be slapped down by everybody else. This theory for peace played into Austrian strengths. Ever since the French Revolution, Austria had positioned itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law. Accordingly, they began to expand their diplomatic influence and cultivate a following of smaller states, especially in Central Europe, who feared being swallowed up by the regional instability that would inevitably follow the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire.
Austria is criminally underrated, bro.
Johnson, you're
Austria is criminally underrated.
Before proceeding, it would be helpful to discuss what the Austrian Empire actually was. What we're really talking about here is the personal holdings of the Habsburg family, which included the lands that had been the Duchy of Austria, but it also included the Kingdom of Hungary, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Croatia, along with a hodgepodge of other titles. It may be helpful to look at the ethnic breakdown of the Austrian Empire, because this will tell you everything you need to know about Austrian politics. First and foremost, there was the German-speaking core, centered around Vienna and the old Duchy of Austria. Then there were the Magyars of Hungary, who spoke Hungarian. The third major group were the Bohemians, who spoke Czech. Then in the borderlands, there were Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, and others who spoke various Slavic languages. To the east, there was Transylvania.
Bro, I swear, I always forget that Croatian people and freaking like Bosnian people are Slavs, bro.
Whose inhabitants spoke Romanian. There were also regions where the
Transylvania is Hungary. Changed my mind.
majority spoke Polish and Ukrainian. And although
Whoa! No. Polish and Ruthenian. There's no such thing as a Ukraine. No, that term was invented in the 19th to 21st century. No. Ukrainians didn't even call themselves Ukrainians. They called themselves Ruthenians, which literally just means Rus. Okay, so they spoke Ruthenian, okay, which is basically just a dialect of, well, it's just a Rus dialect in my personal opinion. So
this wasn't the case at this exact moment, the Austrian Empire would soon have a large Italian minority as well. By one count, the Austrian Empire consisted of 14 ethnic groups speaking 17 different languages. The Austrian Empire was really an incredible experiment, one that you don't see anywhere else in the 19th century. This was not the case of one ethnic group dominating their neighbors. This was a true synthesis of cultures and ethnicities united under the Habsburg Emperor.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's really impressive the Austrian Empire held out for as long as it did. And, you know, it really goes to show you that you don't need like a pure ethno state. Like, you don't really need like a pure state just for like one ethnicity. I honestly believe that you can honestly have a state with a bunch of ethnicities and it could work out. I never really understood that whole, like, actually no, I do understand it, but it's gotten to the point where people believe that, oh, because I'm a specific ethnic group, I must have a state with the rest of my people and my ethnic groups. But it's like, why? Why? Is there better economic opportunities or what? Because if your whole reason for having the state is my ethnic group needs to stay, that's extremely dumb. Really dumb.
In the eyes of the Habsburg Emperor, all of these holdings were, at least theoretically, co-equal, which made administering the empire the world's most complicated balancing act. The constraints within the Habsburg system become clear when you look at the crown's relationship with the Kingdom of Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary was home to more than just the ethnic Hungarian population, and when you add everybody together, it accounted for 35 to 40% of the Austrian...
I hate the fact that he has the term Ukrainian there. Bro, oh my god, that's so inaccurate.
Empire's total population.
Oh, that hurts me.
That
hurts me.
Should make it clear why there was tension between the Austrian Germans and the Hungarians. The Habsburg Emperor ruled Hungary as their king, but he was not one of them, and so he was bound by severe constitutional limitations. One of these limitations was that the Hungarian king was not allowed to tax the people of Hungary. The local Hungarian aristocracy was allowed to tax the people, but they were under no obligation to pass that money along to their king. Again, this is 35 to 40% of the empire's population we're talking about. This exemption created a massive hole in the imperial budget that Austria was constantly trying to fill. Over the centuries, this arrangement resulted in the Hungarian aristocracy becoming extremely rich, even though the Hungarian people remained quite poor compared to the German-speaking population to the west. The Hungarian king was also constrained when it came to military recruitment. Despite being home to 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire, Hungarian subjects only made up like 5% of its military. This number could fluctuate. During the Napoleonic Wars, it climbed as high as 20%, but in order to accomplish that, the Habsburg Emperor had to go to the Hungarian aristocracy and give them whatever they wanted. This tenuous constitutional relationship meant that Austria was cursed in a way to be in constant negotiations with itself. The Hungarians were always suspicious of any territorial gains that added more ethnic Germans to the empire. The whole political system was a delicate balance, and if the ethnic Germans got something, the Hungarians always wanted something too. Despite all of its contradictions, the Austrian Empire had a lot of credibility on the international stage. Whatever the reasons, the fact that Austria was not primarily concerned with territorial expansion mattered a lot, especially to all of those tiny Central European states who had recently been made vulnerable by the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire.
You know, another thing to note is that Prussia also took Silesia from Austria, thus taking away a huge German group as well.
It meant that despite having the weakest military of the great powers, Austria had a lot of friends, at a time when having a lot of friends was a valuable thing to have. None of this was true of the other German great power. In many ways, Austria's mirror opposite. Where Austria was old, they were young. Where Austria was defined by their diversity, they were defined by their Germanness. Where Austria was weaker militarily than they could be, they were stronger militarily than they ought to be. Where Austria was not that interested in territorial expansion, they were obsessed with it to the point where they thought of very little else. The two
Russia
were brothers, but they were brothers that did not get along.
Brothers that don't get along. I relate to that so hard.
In 1814, the thing that defined Prussia was its precarity. It was the smallest of the great powers, in every way. It had a tiny population of 10 million people, 3 times less populous than France, and almost 5 times less populous than Russia. It was also small geographically. As you can see, its tiny population was crammed into a bunch of isolated pockets that weren't even connected to each other. It was also precarious.
How in the world do people even know the borders? Figure out what the borders were? Like, how do people figure this
out? As
out?
I've already discussed, Central Europe was no longer under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant that tiny Prussia was now vulnerable to its much larger neighbors. Vulnerable might be underselling it. The Prussians had enlisted Russian help against the French, but now there were Russians everywhere. Poland was under joint Russian and Prussian occupation, but there were also Russians occupying the Polish-speaking areas of eastern Prussia, and they weren't leaving. Russians were also occupying Saxony along Prussia's southern border, and these guys weren't leaving either. Central Europe was in a state of flux. It was clear to everybody that Russia saw opportunity here, which was entirely antithetical to the balance of power principle. The other great powers would have no choice but to respond. In the eyes of people like Metternich and Castlereagh, Russia had to remove itself from Central Europe if there was ever to be peace. Prussia had to become the kind of great power that was capable of resisting Russian influence.
What type of music is this? I hope this is not copyrighted.
That was the priority of the Prussian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Karl August von Hardenberg. The experience with Napoleon had taught Hardenberg that Prussia was not yet a true great power. It was powerful regionally, but it was too small to have a global impact. In order to graduate from a regional power to a great power, Prussia needed people, Prussia needed resources, and Prussia needed territory. This line between a strong regional power and a weak great power is a fuzzy one. Eric Hobsbawm writes that, quote, Austria and Prussia were really great powers by courtesy only. Continuing later, their chief function was to act as European stabilizers. It's true that Austria and Prussia could not match the global influence of France, Britain, and Russia. I would quibble slightly and say that Austria's diplomatic influence at this time made them a great power, but it's true that Prussia lacked the global reach of any of the other powers. The only reason everybody decided to treat them as a great power was their formidable military. By the end of the war, on a per capita basis, Prussia was fielding 6 times more soldiers than Austria, which meant that despite their relative weakness, they were capable of going toe-to-toe with any other great power. Hardenberg saw in Prussia an urgent need for territorial expansion. All of these isolated enclaves would not do. They were just asking to be swallowed up by some stronger power.
Yep.
In the upcoming peace conference, Prussia hoped to gain some territorial coherence and become a true great power with global influence.
Is that it? We didn't get more on Prussia? Well, this is a part 2, so...
The original plan was for the 4 victorious great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, to dominate the peace conference and impose their will upon everyone else. But Tsar Alexander's behavior had begun to make people nervous, and Russia's creeping domination over Prussia seemed a disaster waiting to happen. If there was a serious split at the conference, with Britain and Austria on one side and Russia and Prussia on the other, it was difficult to imagine how they could possibly resolve it without descending into another war. Metternich and Castlereagh saw this looming crisis before them, and so they approached Talleyrand and asked him to represent France at Vienna. France remained a great power, and so it made very little sense to exclude them from shaping the post-war world. Besides, Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated and removed from power, which meant that France was theoretically a normal country again. Naturally, nothing could have pleased Talleyrand more. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled in Hardenberg of
what
who
you did
was
there.
still keen on finding a way to resist Russian influence, and got him to agree. This left Tsar Alexander isolated when the four other great powers came to him and demanded that France be given a seat at the Congress. He, of course, threw a fit, but then reluctantly agreed. Over the summer, everybody traveled to Vienna, and by everybody, I mean everybody. Virtually every state in Europe sent delegations.
Wow.
And some states that didn't even exist anymore sent delegations as well.
What?
After decades of war, a festive, slightly euphoric mood took over the city. Peace was at hand. When September rolled around, the real work began.
Excellent video. If you like what I got to say, my reactions, go check out my other reactions. If you got any suggestions for me, go comment it down below. Make sure to subscribe if you watch all of my video, bruh. Come on. Subscribe, man. I know you like what I got to say in my reactions, man. I'm like one of the only few reaction channels who actually like give insightful thoughts on my videos, okay? So, do I deserve more subscribers? Yes. But I'm a patient man. I don't really expect to. Well, I'm steadily building up my audience. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.